Today, we're going to cover one of my favorite subjects. I had a lot of fun teaching this subject over and over again to my children, the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel it's our backstory for where we are today and why things are the way they are today. One of the many backstories. But this is a big one. Before we begin, though, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, this is history, and this is your word. And your word gives us a little glimpse of it, and we can piece together a little bit about what happened. And Lord, you've also provided other historical sources, and it is hard for us to sort through them all. But Lord, I ask that you would be with us now, guide us into your word, help us to gain understanding from what happened in the past, so that we can understand where we are now, Lord, and what your plan is. And Lord, we thank you for all that you've done. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I use a lot of sources for this one, just like the last one. The main sources for this in the Bible are Genesis 10 through 11, which would include the LXX, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text, or the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, and quotations from the early church fathers regarding this. There's a lot from the early church fathers about what we're covering today. Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, chapters 4 through 6 cover this material. I don't have a handout for you today, but what I was going to do was put that, and I was going to do more stories about Babel from everywhere else. But here we've got Josephus quotes from the Grecian Sibyl and Hestasius, who also gives stories about the Tower of Babel and its downfall. And also, for those of you interested, if you've ever looked at the Table of Nations and wondered, what are these names? Who are these people? In Genesis 10 talks about all the people that came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And they have all these different names. And all these different names also point to locations. And what's awesome is that Josephus gives us a lot of information on those names and places that would be otherwise difficult to understand, because a lot of names of places change, or the Greeks call it one thing, the Hebrews call it another, and the locals call it still another. I mean, just like here in America, what do we call Germany? I just said it. What do they call themselves? Do they say, I am Deutsch, yeah? Deutschland. Yeah, why don't we call it Deutschland? Well, because they're Germans. Maybe that's what the Romans call them, Germania. All right, also Eusebius's Chronicon and Eusebius's Preparation of the Gospel, 2 great books for you to get. So that would be another good handout. I'll just print these books off and give them to you. Eusebius quotes from Abydenus' History of the Chaldeans, and these are ancient historians. History of the Chaldeans and Assyrians. Alexander Polyhistor, another ancient historian. Book on the Chaldeans, the Grecian Sibyl, just like also Josephus quoted, and Castor's Chronicles. A lot of info from the heathen historians about the Tower of Babel. That really happened. Well, the ancient world knew it happened, and the ancient world knew the flood happened. Today, a lot of people have amnesia, or believe that mankind has amnesia and doesn't remember what happened. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher, he also wrote about the Tower of Babel, and he wrote about historically and what happened with Nimrod and all that. Theophilus, one of the ante-Nicene fathers, he quotes also from the Sibyl. Actually, he gives a more of a quote from the Sibyl, the Grecian Sibyl, about the tale of the Tower of Babel. I.P. Corey's ancient, and I'm sitting here telling you all this stuff. You should buy this stuff, really. It's good. You can, if you have a Kindle, you can download it all for like 99 cents a piece. And this is some of the best information on earth about this stuff.
Is it in English?
It's in English. Yeah, most importantly, it's in English. So we owe a great deal of debt to the people that have continually kept these things going, and they're still available. Okay, the timing of the Tower of Babel is important. But I do want to say this. I struggled over, even as just before I came here, I was thinking, I really want to put some BC dates on here. But in the final analysis, I just didn't want to, after all, because there's too much variability with the early church fathers, the Greek Septuagint, and the Hebrew text, and all the things that Eusebius was talking about to give a specific BC date. Now, when we're going through the Exodus here in the coming weeks, I will do that. But here I left them off because there is probably a good 300, 400, 500 year swing, okay, for when this could be. But in terms of timing with respect to Noah and the flood, this generation of Peleg, you see, Noah had Shem had Arphaxad had Shelah, who had Heber, who had Peleg. Peleg is the key to understanding when the Tower of Babel happened, because Peleg, his name means division, and Heber, his father, named him for this division of the world at the Tower of Babel. It is not referring to some major earthquake or continental drift that happened in the days of Peleg. It is absolutely referring to the division of the people groups from the tower, the dispersion of the people. So Peleg's generation is key. He may have been a baby when it happened, he may have been a young man when it happened, or he may have been born a few years later when Heber's reflecting on it, saying, well, this is the situation where now I'm going to name my son Peleg. And subsequently, Heber, which is usually written E-B-E-R, Eber, his name Heber is where we get the name Hebrews from. Okay, so Abraham was a Hebrew. That's where we get it from, Heber. But we'll cover that more in a minute. It happened, the Tower of Babel happened before the nations were re-established. The fascinating thing when you read any of the histories, the great histories of that the Assyrians record about themselves, that the Egyptians recorded themselves, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, all these people recorded themselves as being a continuation of what happened before the flood. So they'll have 10 generations that lived before the flood, and then they'll act like all 10 of those generations were their people. And then after the flood, their guy was on the ark, and then their people returned back to the land, or remained in their land, or however they want to word it. So it is a reestablishing of the nations. The Tower of Babel happens before that. So before the written history where we get the Egyptians saying that their first king after the flood, their first pharaoh after the flood, this happens before that first pharaoh after the flood. Okay? Or the first king of Assyria, etc., etc. It's around 400 years after the flood. Remember, I am using Eusebius's and Josephus's and the Septuagint's numbers. Numbers that the church used until the Reformation. Okay? I love the Reformation as much as the next person, the next believer. But I think they were wrong about changing dates that the church had always held. So, whereas if you use the dates that we have to now since the Reformation, the Tower of Babel happened about 100 years after the flood. In actuality, and I will put it that way because I am pretty convinced that those older numbers are correct. In actuality, it's around 400 years after the flood. And about 600 years until Abraham, which means Abraham didn't show up for 1,000 years after the flood. A lot of history between the flood and Abraham. A lot less if you use the more modern numbers, the later numbers. Okay, so God's command. We had the flood happened, and now Noah and his family are off the ark. God gives the command, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We get that in Genesis 9:1. So that is the command to mankind. They were filling the earth beforehand. They weren't flooded because they weren't filling the earth. They were flooded for their great wickedness, right? Now God says, I want you good people to go and fill the earth and replenish it. And so these good people are supposed to bear seed after their own kind and be good and have righteousness fill the earth. Noah is their leader. He's going to live 350 years after the flood. But he's not going to live to the Tower of Babel. There's a problem, though. Josephus records that whereas Noah comes down from the mountains of Ararat and is living somewhere, remember he plants a vineyard. Okay? Josephus records from Jewish history that the other people stayed up in the mountains because they were afraid of another flood, and it took a while for them to come down and feel comfortable. You know, it's a fascinating thing is what happens to these people as they reflect on the post-flood world. I mean, the pre-flood world. As their children ask questions about the pre-flood world. Well, what was it like? Because we're having a hard time here. You know, you said there were cities. What's a city? I mean, these kids are curious. And God flooded the whole earth. Well, how do we know He's not going to flood it again? But He told us He won't. There's this fear. These are the seeds of the wickedness that's going to come in the future from here. They are a farming society. They are stationary. They're staying put. You know, I'm not here to get into an evolution debate. I don't care. I really honestly don't care. But evolutionists always like to portray mankind as coming from some greater ape, and then they eventually make their way hunter-gatherers, and then they're farmers. I find that it depends on the situation that you're on, if you're a hunter-gatherer or a farmer. There are hunter-gatherers alive to now. Are they still evolving? Can we not teach them to farm? It's because of the situation that they're in. Cain was a farmer. Yeah. So we've known farming for a long time. But here we see this is a farming society. Noah plants a vineyard. He harvests grapes. He's got that vineyard long enough that he can make wine and get drunk, right? And guess what? His son Ham's youngest son Canaan is alive when this happens. That should tell you how many years have passed. Ham had several children, okay, and his youngest one is alive. And by the time that Noah, so they're in that area. The Bible is at least giving us a clue that Josephus may be right, because they are in some area where they can plant, and so they're farming. And after many years, they leave together. The way Josephus puts it is Moses. Just kidding. The way that Josephus, Moses, you see how it happens. Noah finally convinced them to come down from the mountains, and they leave this mountainous region, okay, up in here somewhere. And now they become a hunter-gatherer society because they are nomadic. When you're a nomad and you're traveling, you can plant crops. You really can, right? But if you're going in one direction and you're not going to return, what's the point in planting those crops? So you're going to be gathering things and you're going to be hunting. God allowed mankind to eat meat after the flood, which is fascinating. So we see that these people now have to hunt to try to get their food, and when you're not farming, okay, hunting is going to become more important. So I need to just stress to you, hunting is important, and the hunters are going to be looked upon very favorably because they're providing food for the whole society, as well as those that can gather. These people are cooperating, and they have everything in common. They have one language. They're one people group. Okay, Noah's going to live 350 years after the flood. He's going to die before the Tower of Babel. So these people have Noah to look to, and they have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but Noah is the one that was righteous in God's eyes. Okay, Noah and his sons were preserved. So they're together, and things are going well. The population is growing. It's going to grow over these close to 400 plus years before the Tower of Babel, and it's going to grow after that. But the population is getting very large. Since they came down from the mountains of Ararat, now they're going to go on a treacherous journey. And the way Genesis puts it, you can translate it that they're either coming from the east or they're traveling to the east. If they're coming from the east, then they're going to come down the Tigris River. If they're traveling east, then they're going to come down the Euphrates River, because they're going to wind up in a land that is in between the Tigris and Euphrates, that is very fertile, the land of Shinar. So now they're going to make the treacherous journey. And they're hunter-gatherers. They're going to go through some very difficult terrain, difficult because, I had it here. So if the ark rested on Mount Ararat, then they started here. If the mount rested on Mount Judy, then they started here. Okay, wherever the ark was, they either made their way down the Tigris or the Euphrates. They could have wandered, meandered, followed streams and whatnot and come down this way, or wandered and come down this way. Whatever it was, they either came down the Tigris or the Euphrates. Here's a satellite picture. We have the Euphrates over here and the Tigris here. And what I want you to know, if you can't tell, it's only green where the river is. On the east and west, it is desert. So if you've got this massive group of people, these hunter-gatherers that are going down, following the river down to wherever it's going to lead them, they're following the direction of the current of the river, then they're only going to have access to what is here around the river. If they send out scouts, let's send out scouts east and west and see what we find. Nothing but desert. The hunters are going to be vitally important. Okay? I just want to continue to emphasize to you the hunters are important. Now, this treacherous journey finally ends in this beautiful land of Shinar. We have the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers coming together, and then they come close by, and then they separate again. But this whole land of Shinar, this is modern-day Iraq. This whole land of Shinar, the plains of Shinar, it is beautiful. It is great for planting crops. It is a great place to stop and rest and not worry so much about surviving through hunting and gathering. Okay? And just to drive the point home, this is a zoom in of modern day Iraq. When we think of Iraq here in America, we think it's one big desert. Well, this is the Fertile Crescent, my friends. This is all farmland. Okay? So it's not all desert over there, and it certainly wasn't all desert there. But this is where they stopped. They stopped in Shinar, and they stopped in this place called Babel, or Babel, however you want to say it. They become a farming society again. Still, the hunters are important. Noah dies, and then there's a post-flood resentment against God. As I told you before, the children of Shem, Ham, and Japheth are all asking questions. Daddy, what's the city? Here's how I put it to my own kids. I said, imagine if we were the only family that survived, and then your children are asking you about, Daddy, what's a TV? Daddy, what's a microwave? This was a marketplace. There was supermarkets. You can go and get food like that. That all sounds great. Why did God destroy all that? Is God nice or what? Sounds like He's not so nice. Daddy, no, you don't understand. Those people were evil. Oh, they couldn't have been that bad. I mean, we don't have it as easy as you all had it, Dad. So there is a real post-flood resentment against God, and it's growing. Okay, it's growing. Noah's great-grandson is extremely resentful, and he's very ambitious, and he's the leader of the hunters. Okay? Let me add this. When you're a hunter-gatherer society, what do you need for gathering?
Your hands.
Oh, you need your hands and basket, some sort of container. Yeah. All right. Is it easy to bludgeon someone to death with a basket?
Or you could beat them with sheaves.
Yeah, you beat them with sheaves. What about hunters? What are their implements? Weapons. Hunters have weapons. Okay, and hunters are also physically fit and trained. Okay, it's not going and sitting in a deer blind drinking a 6-pack of beer at 5 a.m. and shooting at corn-fed does. These people are out in the field. Remember Esau when he went hunting and he didn't get anything and he was so tired, he's like, I'm going to die. He's yelling, I'm going to die, he's telling his brother. And he sits down in a big huff because he's just about to starve to death, because he's got all this energy. But anyway, these people are athletically fit and they have weapons and they're used to seeing things die. This is a great breeding ground for turning the weapons from the animals to the people and getting them to do what you want, which is what happens with the great-grandson of Noah. Let's read Genesis chapter 10, verses 6 through 12. Hopefully we can clear up some things that some in the church are confused about. So Genesis chapter 10, that very same chapter is the table of nations, where it talks about all the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Chronologically speaking, chapter 10 happens after chapter 11, because it talks about people that are existing way after chapter 11. So it's always good to start in chapter 10 to at least get this key person here. All right, chapter 10, verse 6 through 12. The sons of Ham, and Ham is the son of Noah. The sons of Ham were Cush and Mitzrayim and Put and Canaan. The sons of Cush were Seba and Havilah and Sabta and Raamah and Sabteka. And the sons of Rahamah were Sheba and Dedan. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. Hey, Nimrod wasn't in that list. That's interesting. Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth Ir and Calah and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. All right, let's unpack that. The lineage of this guy Nimrod is Noah, Ham, Cush, and then Nimrod. Cush had 5 named sons. Nimrod is not listed in that first list we get. Nimrod is set apart. Why is he set apart? He's a 6th son, and there's something important about him that the Bible has to say. And the fascinating thing is that Nimrod takes place just before, who is a great man on the earth, a mighty warrior, a great hunter, and a great in the eyes of men, just before we get into the whole story, and a little bit of time spent on him, just before we get into the story about one that is great in the eyes of God, Abraham, and a lot of time is spent on that. So that is on purpose that Moses portrays it this way. Nimrod is the Hebrew word for rebel or rebellion or any sort of synonym of these. The name is a descriptor of what he was and what he did. He rebelled. In fact, Nimrod may not even be his name. He might be one of those, or this might be a name for he who must not be named type of names. We just call him that rebel, okay? And so that's the idea there. In fact, when it says that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, as many commentators have said in the earliest church, as well as Josephus, in giving us the Jewish understanding, that word before should probably be translated for our sake as against, because that's the idea. He was a mighty hunter against the Lord. God was his enemy. And that's the way that he saw it. He was a mighty one, which is a gibor in Hebrew. It means powerful warrior or tyrant. In Greek, it's gigas, which is like the giants that waged war against the gods in Greek mythology. The Greeks believe that the giants fought against the gods. And here, this one is, for the Greeks, being called a giant. So he is like one of the giants who is waging war against God. And he is a tyrant. He's also a hunter. Tzayid, meaning hunter in Hebrew, or kunigas, which is hunter of animals in the Greek. So he was a hunter. We see how this, of course, Josephus helps us to see how he transformed from hunting animals to hunting men and seeing God as his prey. Before the Lord. Panim, which means in front of, in the presence of, in the Greek. And enantion means contrary to, opposite of, an opponent of. So he is an opponent of God. He puts himself before the Lord. He puts himself first. Okay, this is Nimrod. His kingdom begins at Babel. It begins, and he turned his hunters into warriors. And this is where you should really read Josephus. He turns his hunters into warriors. He himself becomes a warrior. He told the people that God was their enemy, and that if anybody gave God any credit, it's a sign of weakness. He said, we are the ones who have a name for ourselves here. We are the ones who go hunting. We are the ones who get the food. We are the ones who survived. Okay, this is Nimrod. Now you have to read other sources to get the full story on Nimrod. Okay, but if you read and understand these words that are being used to describe him, we can misuse it in our own way. Just like in Genesis 6, where it says that the sons of God came down and had children with the daughters of men, and these were the heroes of old, the men of renown. That sounds really good. They're heroes of old. We love heroes. Men of renown. It's not meant in that way. They're wicked, evil tyrants. Oppressive, violent tyrants. And that is the same way that Nimrod is. He's the first great tyrant after the flood. He said that God wanted them to fill the earth, because God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. He said, the reason God wants to do that is so that he can keep us separate and control us. We will stay together. Okay, are you getting a picture of this guy, I hope? And here's a big one, and this is the way that Josephus puts it. He gradually turned the government into tyranny so that nothing could be done without the government's say, without his government's say. And that reliance on God was seen as weakness. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So he's a big government guy, so long as he's the one in charge, of course, which is typically how it happens. Everybody's a big government guy if their guy's in office.
I got a question. Is this guy still alive?
No, he's dead. He's dead. But you could write him in. But
Well, the reason I ask is it sounds very familiar.
he does. You know, the type is very familiar, and certainly Nimrod here in Babel, which is Babylon, is a type of Antichrist himself. The tower. Let's look at Genesis 11. Hi, Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they begin to do? And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. The beginning of Nimrod's kingdom was Babel. There's plenty of Middle Eastern historians who attribute Nimrod as being the great enemy of God from of old. And there are still places that are named Nimrod, Nimrud, or rebellion to commemorate his wickedness. And so it's hard for us, unless you really observe the Bible carefully, to see who is this Nimrod, where is he located, and what does he have to do with the building of this city. Josephus also ties it in there. It was built with bricks, and it was inlaid with bitumen, the tar. They put pitch on it. For what purpose? Waterproof. That's right. As Josephus puts it, he said, if God has a mind to flood the earth again, then we will go into the tower and be safe, and we will ascend the tower and take from God the keys of the kingdom of earth. And it's fascinating because a Greek playwright named Thucydides, who wrote a play called Utopia, makes a reference to this in one of his acts. It's a terrible play, by the way. But in this one act, he's telling the birds to go and do as they did in Babylon, and to build a great tower and ascend it and wrestle from the gods the keys to the earth, just like the Babylonians wanted to do. So this idea is definitely, completely, should be seen with respect to what happened in the ark. Whereas they were safe in the ark, now Nimrod has taken this ark idea and said, no, it'll be stationary. It'll be a city. We'll make a name for ourselves. He and his government. We will not be scattered. We will stay here. If it floods, we'll be safe. And we're strong enough to go into heaven and take the keys from God. Pretty ambitious. He believed his own press, I think. Yes, it does seem to be a system of worship. It's going to turn into a system. Yeah. Yes. Right. So, likely though, this Tower of Babel was like a ziggurat. Has anyone seen a ziggurat? I've got pictures of ziggurats, so you'll see them here in a moment. Okay, it was probably not some, as a lot of artists, and especially from the Renaissance and Middle Ages, like to depict it as this tower with all these archways and open air. Come on, open air. It's inlaid with bitumen. Come on. It's because they don't want any water to get in there. The sin of the tower is rebellion against what God had commanded. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Go and fill the earth again. Replenish it. No, we will not. They're glorifying man over God, and they're cursing God. And Babylon is the source of all false religions to this day. It all begins here at Babylon. Isn't it interesting when you read in Revelation, Mystery Babylon the Great? It's the source of all false religions, happens here. Noah dies. Within 50 years, this happens. Okay? You can't go to look to Noah anymore and say, well, what happened? Shem, Ham, and Japheth may well still be alive. Shem's still alive. But there's nothing he can do about it. He's not going to be listened to. I also think it's interesting here, God, several hundred years earlier, destroyed the earth with flood. Here, he's just changing their language to get them to spread. So it is a bit of grace or mercy that he extends to them. So the languages are confused rather than wiping them out. It says here, some people will read where God says, this is what they choose to do, and now nothing will be impossible for them to do. They say, see, God's afraid of us, because if we all come together as one people, we can do anything. That's what the Bible says. No, the context here is the wickedness. This thing that they did. They're all together, and then they decide to do wickedness. And now, great wickedness. They can do anything with this great wickedness. Nothing will be impossible for them. God's not mad that they built a city. God's not mad that they built a tower. God allows cities and towers. It is the spirit with which they did it. It is this rebellion against God. It's this Nimrod rebellion. All right, so the context of that is not because God's afraid, oh no, mankind's going to develop technology to the point where I won't be able to stop them. Yeah, he spoke the universe into existence. He can certainly... He went down to see this great tower that they built. I love the way that it's written there. God had to come down. Okay, so Babel means confusion. And here's the thing. You gotta think about what this situation must have been like. You have an assembly line of workers, okay, who are another bag, another bag, another bag, another bag. Give me the brick or whatever they're getting, whatever they're doing, okay? We need more water over here. It is a massive working project. The Grecian Sibyl records that it's in the midst of while it was being done. this thing happened. The gods, although the Sibyl says that the gods came down. But in the midst of this project, with your friends that you've known for who knows how long, you're saying, hand me the bag. But that's not what they hear. And so how does this person respond? Why are you saying that? You sound stupid. What do you say? You sound stupid. And then this little conversation is happening all over this construction project. Not just the construction project, but in the cities, or in the city itself. It's happening in the fields. People are talking to each other. They're not understanding one another. They know that they're in rebellion against God. They know that God has come with judgment and that this is the judgment. They are going to freak out, okay? I had an original plan to just start talking in a different language to you and freak out and leave the room, but I decided against it. Would that have worked? No? Okay. But I want you to understand how scary the situation would be, and also how Nimrod must have responded to it. Because suddenly all these people are freaking out and they're running. They're running. Now the good news is that the families all are speaking the same language. So it's not like the husband comes home to his wife and they don't understand each other, because they leave out in people groups, which is where Heber comes in. Heber is one of those that left. Okay? And he became a mighty person who led his people away, and that's how these people groups got named. A lot of them got named because of the people that led them away from Babel. Whoever the important person was, that's the name of the people group. So the people scatter, and but they only have limited choices on how to leave, right? You can either go up the Tigris or the Euphrates, and that's a long trip. That's going to be like a one-way street. You know, a people group, if they stop in the middle of this journey and they're in the Tigris or the Euphrates, and they say, well, I think we'll stop and build a nice place here along the river. Who's with me? Oh, yeah, let's do it. Well, what's coming behind them? Another group. And what do you think that group's going to think?
If they're bigger, they're going to take you over.
If they're bigger, or maybe you've made some fortifications and they say, look, they built a fortification, we must go and attack them. This is how the earth moves, man. We're going to stop here in this land. I like this land. Let's stay here. And someone comes behind them and says, we like that land too. I think we'll stay here. And then they fight. And now these people are displaced and they're forced to move somewhere else, where somebody else is. This is the movement of the people. This starts the great war of everyone against everyone. And this is what moves people. This is why some people to this day are still running from Babel. This is why we still have these Stone Age people who are, you see pictures of them in National Geographic. No one's talked to them, and now we're trying to fight so that no one ever will talk to them, so that they can continue in that state. I have a great book for you to read. It's called Spirit of the Rainforest. It's about a Yanomamo Indian shaman who converted to Christianity. He tells the story of what it's like living in the Stone Ages, and how resentful those people are to National Geographic especially, and other people who say, leave them alone and let them live that way. He said, we're poor, we're hot, we're starving, we have nothing, and we have nowhere to go, because everywhere we go we're being fought against. So we have to live out here in the jungle, and you wouldn't like it either. So it can be glorified, and I know I'm not trying to come against anybody that's environmentalist, but it can be glorified incorrectly by people such as that say, no, they're living the way that all of us should be living. And those people are saying, no, we hate it here. We're miserable. So these people are running, and some people are going to have advantages of the first place that they come upon. They may be able to keep it, or they may keep it for a little while, and they may be forced to leave. They may join forces with some other group, and they may come up with a new language together, or a new culture that's blended. All sorts of things happen. Now, the fascinating thing is, these stories go with them. And that's part of why you get these wacky stories that I gave you last week about the flood. Okay? It changes over time. It really does. It is fascinating.
That's also the beginning of nations against nations.
Yes, it is.
That's continued to this day.
To this day. To this day. How did our nation get founded? Rebellion against England. First, England sent colonists. France sent colonists. Spain.
Basically by oppression, because people came over here seeking freedom from slavery and et al. In England.
Sure, and religious persecution and all that, right.
Yeah.
They come here to this land that, it's still England's property. And England made deals, and France made deals with the Indians, and then misunderstandings happen. But over time, here we are, manifest destiny. Right? We didn't start it, and we actually didn't do it. I mean, nobody here did, right? But it's a great migration, and there's heroes and villains and great people that were just glorified by you really saved us. He brought us across that terrible river. Or another great book for you to read is Eternity in Their Hearts. That's a good one. Some of the tribes that are written of are talking about this type of incident. There was one that went into India, and they were still following God. Some of these people are following God, some of them aren't. But they came to India, they were coming to India, and there were mountains that they couldn't get over. And one of them said, there are gods in these mountains that we must appease. Oh, a great time to become a new priest. There's gods. And they appeared to me. And named me their priest. So I need extra food, clothing, the prettiest women. What else? What's the house on the hill? Yeah. All right. So everybody starts here at the Tower of Babel and works their way out. Like I said, you could go further down Shinar. If you don't mind being close to Nimrod. Nimrod, who's the king of the world, who just lost his mighty empire. Okay. So you could come down this way, and some do, and some come this way. The Persians come over here. The Medes come up here. Some go up the Euphrates and then come down into Canaan, the land of Canaan, the Canaanites, right? And then the Egyptians, and then the people of Cush, and then all those who live in sub-Sahara Africa that keep going and keep getting pushed down because they couldn't keep the Egyptians or couldn't knock the Egyptians out of Egypt, and they couldn't knock the Cushites out of Cush, so they got knocked into the jungles of sub-Sahara Africa, which is dense and hard to tame. Others, of course, went into Europe. I have the very common picture, you may have seen it before. The sons of Japheth go into Europe, and they spread out this way, and there's some intermingling. The sons of Shem stay in the Middle East area. The sons of Ham go into Africa. And you have some sons of Ham in North Africa, and then some sons of Ham in sub-Saharan, south of the Sahara Desert, Africa. Which the Nile is your safe passage. You know how the Tigris and Euphrates looked? It was green along the Tigris and Euphrates. Well, it's green along the Nile too. So you can travel through the desert, the Sahara Desert, if you stay along the banks of the Nile. You should be fine. Just don't go swimming with crocodiles. Nimrod, though. Nimrod after Babel. His goal is to regain what he lost through global conquest. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Then he built other cities in Shinar. The land of Shinar is here. He builds these cities in Shinar. Some of these are very famous cities of old. And he then, after X number of years, he travels north into the land of Asher. Asher was one of the sons of Shem. He was a Semite. And his people were defeated by Nimrod's people, and he took over Asher. He took over Assyria. And there in Assyria, he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Kala, and Rezin. Let me tell you something. We have a real problem with this name Nimrod, okay? As I told you before, it's probably not even his name. So trying to find this guy in history, no one's done it yet, okay? No one's pinned. There are some good guesses of who Nimrod is historically, but that's all we have, our guesses. So I can't say to you his actual name was Gobbledygook, which is itself kind of gobbledygook. Also, the names of these cities may not be the original names that he gave them. City names get updated in the Bible by later scribes when one name is forgotten. I'll show you examples of that maybe starting next week. So he probably had this, he had Assyria and he had Shinar. He had Assyria and Babylon as his empire. And he probably had governors that were over Assyria and governor that was over Babylon. And he himself was the empire, the king of nations. The emperor, king, labeled king of nations. Because fascinatingly, in Genesis chapter 14, we see there's a war. And at the time of this war, Shinar, Assyria, and Persia are all together. So in Nimrod's lifetime, he was only able to get Shinar and Assyria, or Babylon and Assyria. Now, there's some recordings in the history of the Armenians, where they say that Nimrod died in battle fighting against Armenia, which was up here, that he was trying to expand his kingdom up here, and that he died up there. May be true. So his story here is actually the backstory for the events that you see in Genesis 14. His story is actually the backstory for what we see in a lot of ancient history, which is this massive struggle between Babylon, Assyria, and Persia. And Genesis 14, they're all together. After Genesis 14 and the defeat that they face, they're split apart. Next time we see in the Bible. Assyria wants to dominate Babylon. Babylon wants to dominate Assyria. Persia wants to dominate. They want to dominate each other. And that's history. Okay. All right, the world after Babel. Nimrod died around 200 years later. Isn't that fascinating? He had a long life. These post-flood people that were closer to the time of the flood lived for a long time. His son had him worshipped as a god. Very common thing to happen. You're a great king. The story goes, you're this awesome king, and then after you're dead and other people still lift you on high, they exalt your stories and exaggerate them, and yada, 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 he's a god now. In fact, this sort of thing happens in many tribes, where the hero is worshipped, their great ancestor. And then they can also become a god among the other gods, the pre-flood world gods. Because these people know about the pre-flood world. They have their stories that they've mixed and mingled with the things that they're doing. But some were still faithful to God. That's the fascinating thing. A fun thing is to go through the book of Genesis and see how many people are actually faithful to God. You'll find a lot of Canaanites that are faithful to God. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, the king of Jerusalem, was faithful to God. Abraham's three friends, Aner, Eshel, and Mamre, they were all faithful to God. King Abimelech was faithful to God. So it's not everybody turns from God at Babel, but a lot of them do. And plus you have this strange situation where some people are living a long time, but generations that come after them have shorter lifespans. So it could be that when you were young, there was a middle-aged looking man, and now you're old, and he's still a middle-aged looking man. He must be immortal. Okay? Now after many generations, everybody starts to have a similar lifespan. But in that interim period where the earlier generations living longer, the younger generations are going to look at them and say, these must be immortals. Mythology, my friends, mythology comes from all this. The religion of the day becomes confusion because of Babel. This whole world is in confusion because people don't believe this story. And they don't believe the flood. I don't care that I gave you evidence that these other cultures that didn't have interaction with Europeans already had the flood story. Because it happened. Okay? This world doesn't care. To them it's a fable. It's all a myth. And religion is confused. The tower itself was eventually converted into a temple. And you can read Herodotus's... he actually went to the temple in Babylon, and he saw it. So the tower becomes a temple, and it's rebuilt rebuilt many times over thousands of years. Now the fascinating thing is what we see around the world post-Babel. We see towers all over the world for people groups that supposedly have nothing to do with one another. Towers. So this is a ziggurat. This is like probably what the Tower of Babel looked like. And then what later temples did look like. Again, you should read Herodotus and what he says about the temple in Babylon. But it looked like this, and then at the top you have the god is up there. You worship the god up there. This, of course, is in the Middle East. And this is a drawing of what in the Middle East. This, of course, is where? Middle America? Yeah, Aztecs, Mayans. This is in Egypt. This is also in Egypt. This is in China. I forget where this one is. But all over the world, Indonesia, all over the world, you have these pyramids, these towers, and they all look alike. From these people groups that have no relation to one another, according to modern thought. Why are they all building these towers? Where on earth did they get these ideas from? Well, anyway, here's the ruins today of the Ziggurat of Babylon. You can look it up on Google Earth. They even have it labeled as Tower of Babel. So it's pretty fun. But it's right here.
What is it, Jeremy? I mean, is it a pile of rubble?
Yeah, it's debris now. Yeah, it's ruins. Which is not the first time it happened. So according to Herodotus, in his day, it had already been rebuilt several times. So, these things get destroyed. Or they get dilapidated, depending on how well... Maybe Nimrod wasn't such a good construction.
Well,
he should have gotten permits.
Bitumen wore out.
The bitumen. Yeah, indeed. So anyway, that's the Tower of Babel. That is why we are in the situation we're still in today. The truth is that we are all one people. And I'm going to tell you something that I find personally to be very fascinating to me. I come from a certain stock of people, the Celts. Okay, on my father's side, I'm Scottish. On my mother's side, I'm Irish. So I'm Celtic. It's not that I can go back to Ireland and say, I'm back. I'd like to. It'd be kind of nice. But that is where I come from. My wife, her family are of the Dravidian family, some of the first people that ever made it into India. And her family had been there for thousands of years. Her parents were the first ones to move away and come here to the United States. So this Celt married this Indian. And we have children. Because we are one race and one family. Behold my son. Back there, smile and wave, Seth. We really are one people. But we really must obey God. And so the story of Babel is the story of us all. It is our common ancestry. And God is not opposed to cities and towers. He's opposed to rebellion against Him and disobedience.